So like today's lecture, of course, I'll be getting into discussing mostly like the kind of the central high part of the Middle Ages. Mostly going to talk about two things today. The Viking Age, kind of spent a lot of time on that today. And then I will get into the Crusades, kind of a very famous event. Probably one of the most famous events maybe that happened in the Middle Ages, I would say, was the Crusades. So from last time, lecture-wise, I think we had been talking about the early Middle Ages. I kind of went into and discussed the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire. We talked about the rise of Islam. And then I think the last thing I did was I talked about how in medieval Europe, they had the rise of the Franks. We had the Merovingian, Carolingian, dynasties that ruled Western Europe, like France, Germany, Italy, etc. And I talked about how it peaked under Emperor Charlemagne, who kind of unified the West. And again, all that from before. But all that starts to kind of come to an end, of course, because of the Viking Age. We're going to, of course, talk about that today, which is a big thing that, of course, occurs that's kind of important overall. And the so-called Viking Age, which you can see there. Of course, there's that Osberg longship they're talking about. Of course, that was found in the early 1900s. Of course, the outbreak of the Viking Age is something that you start seeing, at that time, which kind of starts around about the 8th, 9th centuries is about when I guess the Viking Age kind of gets started at that point. And they think it's something that started around 8th, 9th century when you have these Scandinavian peoples that begin to leave. And they start settling in parts of Europe. They really invade. A lot of them do, of course. It's kind of an extension of the migration period that went back to like the 3rd, 4th centuries in Europe, when you have all these Germanic peoples that invade, because the Vikings were kind of somewhat related to the Germanic peoples. At least their culture was kind of influenced by them more than anything. And they are later nicknamed the Norse. The Norsemen, quite common, or also Northmen, like Northmen, I think, or Norman. It's often used because they came out of Northern Europe, sailing from like mostly those areas, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. That's your area, what they call Scandinavia today. You can throw Finland in there too, which is kind of east of Sweden as well. But they also settled, all kinds of areas you can see, like Britain, like parts of Britain, like Eastern England, Northern Scotland, parts of Ireland, Northern France, Iceland, Greenland, the northern part of the Germany, like around the Baltic coast. Southern Italy, believe it or not, in Sicily, you had Vikings that settled there. And then Russia and the Ukraine were other areas that they went into also as well. Looks like Devin is joining us this morning. Hey, what's going on also as well. So yeah, the Vikings start to come into Europe. And you can see, by the way, kind of a map of the areas that they will kind of invade into different parts of Europe and the North Atlantic right here. And so yeah, you can see all those areas that they kind of, so starting at, I guess, as early as the 8th century, you start seeing some Vikings that come in. Supposedly the first area they attacked was an area called, I don't know if you can see it on the map here. It's kind of hard to see. Somewhere like up in the northern part of England, around where Lindisfarne Island is where they attacked, I think around 793 CE or AD. And so that's the first that the Europeans, like in the rest of Christian Europe, start to see some of these pagan type cultures that start to come in from Northern Europe. The term Viking, by the way, is a derogatory term. It's kind of a term meaning like they were like pirates or bandits. I think it comes from a saying which is to go a Viking, which means to go like raiding, which is something they're kind of famous for, the Vikings. But it's kind of like this stereotype that people kind of saw the Vikings as these pirates that would attack people, pillage, rape, and burn, and all that. But the Vikings weren't just that. They were really a culture that was relied a lot on farming. They were great sailors. like the long ship that we, of course, showed the little short video, were like almost like works of art. The way they were constructed, using wood. So yeah, that's that stereotype, you see like in movies and TV shows, and in Hollywood they have Vikings with horns on their helmets, but traditionally I don't know if they ever had horns on their helmets. It's something that kind of Hollywood kind of invented and all that, more or less. Looks like Jessica's joining us also this morning. Hey, what's going on? Also as well. Yeah, of course, that's something that I'll kind of talk about, of course, today. The so-called, like I said, the long ship that they're kind of known for sailing with, which is right here, the so-called Osberg long ship. Of course, we're talking about originally from that little short video they went into from the Smithsonian Channel, the Viking longship. They were these shallow drafted wooden ships. They were very versatile. They could go pretty much anywhere. And so they could sail these ships pretty much like up rivers. They could beach them, and all that. They could go through like lakes and seas, oceans. Believe it or not, they crossed like the Atlantic Ocean in these ships, which is pretty amazing. They also used them as funerary ships. When they would like bury somebody like a chieftain or somebody powerful, they would bury them in their ship, and they think that's what the Osberg ship is. It's like a burial type ship that they discovered in Norway in the early 1900s. And it's, like I said, one of the most preserved ships that they've ever found, that they've kind of restored more or less. And you can see here that they sailed them all over the place. They went like across the Atlantic, Mediterranean Sea, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, Baltic Sea, so all those different seas. They sailed up into at one point, which is pretty amazing. I think they discovered part of North America. I think some people think they may have even explored part of Africa. I think there's theories about that too, maybe. But yeah, their culture was, like I said, very versatile, going all over the world. Hey, Gavin, what's going on also this morning as well? So yeah, Viking ship. And I told you how in Britain they called them dragon ships because they would sometimes put dragon heads and monsters on the front of the ship to kind of scare people and things like that. And that's something they're kind of known for also as well. But they are very, very fast and swift, oar-powered, pretty much. Here's kind of a typical what a Viking ship usually look like. So like with oars and sails being used also as well. So some of the fastest ships up until maybe modern times that were built more or less. So it's kind of like your galley ships that you see like in Italy later. Now, also another thing about the Vikings, they believed in a lot of pagan-like gods, which of course is true about the Vikings. A lot of the Viking religion was heavily influenced by the Germanic peoples. And I think I've called Old Norse, I guess is, kind of the term they sometimes use, or Norse mythology or Norse religion is a term they kind of use. And usually a lot of their gods were kind of warlike, especially like Odin. You're seeing that image. It's probably an idol that they worship more or less. And so with pagan mythology, with the Norse, they had all these different gods they had. They may have like a lot of gods. I think I counted a while back that they may have like maybe 50 or more gods that they believed in. Some of these gods were heavily influenced from German ideas, like northern German tribes in northern Europe. Maybe some Roman influence too, that go into it also as well. Those are some of the most famous gods, of course, you see there. Odin, of course, sometimes called Woden, of course, is their chief god of the warriors who resided at Valhalla. You know about that. His wife is Frigg, of course, seen as a mother goddess to the Vikings. He had two sons, Thor and Balder. Thor, of course, more of a god of the god of thunder and lightning, who often was famous for brandishing a hammer. You probably know that. Of course, Thor is probably one of the most famous gods, today, because he's in a lot of movies and TV shows and things like that now, like in Hollywood. Balder is the god of like bravery, beauty, as well. And then, yeah, Frey and Freya were like these twin gods. They were kind of famous. Freya was like a fertility god, and then Freya was a sister who was like this fertility god that was also associated with like love and I think war. Just kind of like a cross between Aphrodite and Athena. And then Loki, often called the trickster god, was a god associated with like luck, fortune, mischief, and things like that. So those are different gods that they're kind of known for. But over time, I think up to like, I want to say 8th up to like maybe the 10th century or so, they're pretty much like pagan. And in 10th, 11th century, you start seeing the Vikings starting to convert over to Christianity, which it takes a while. But I think by the 11th, 12th century, Scandinavia eventually converts over to Christianity. But yeah, like I said, Odin reigned from Valhalla, which Valhalla is actually this great hall. I think they call it the Hall of Slain, I believe it is. And he reigned at what is called Asgard. And so Asgard, I think, is actually, I think, what they call Viking heaven, where all the gods reside and stuff like that. I don't know if you get to know about this, but I don't know if you know, but like the days of the week, some of them are actually named after the Viking gods. Like Wednesday's named after Thor. Excuse me, Odin, named after Odin. Thursday's named after Thor. And then Friday's named after Frey. So Wednesday's Woden Day or Odin's Day, I guess. Thursday's Thor's Day. And then Friday is Frey's Day. If you get that right there. So thank God it's Frey Day. Well, that kind of thing. So, but anyway, kind of talking about the Viking culture. And another thing about the Vikings, they were also seen as, here's an image of Thor, by the way. The Vikings were also seen as this culture that was known for exploring a lot. They were really the first major explorers, throughout the world at the time, exploring like parts of Europe, exploring parts of the North Atlantic, with their ships and all that. And so the Vikings will start settling all throughout different parts of Europe. I think I've got a map showing you how areas that they kind of explore and settle throughout parts of Europe. It's kind of borrowed from Wikipedia or whatever, but you can see here kind of the direction that they go on. So you can see they start obviously in Scandinavia, and they work their way kind of westward and eastward, like into like the British Isles first here, then move up through Iceland and Greenland. And you can see here they went eastward also like toward the Caspian and Black Seas. Also, you can see they went down like where Spain is, also into like southern Europe, like Italy. So they're obviously all over the place, the Vikings. Everywhere you see in green are kind of areas that they raided at one point, but you can see also areas where they settled at one point throughout different parts of Europe and the North Atlantic. As the main areas they kind of went into more or less. I'll give you examples of areas they settled, like in England, like especially the eastern part of England. They settled in an area called Danelaw, which the Danes are, Vikings from Denmark settled there, which you can kind of see in this map. It's an area that's kind of in this red area right here. They call it area the so-called Danelaw because they were under their own laws, own Viking laws, Dane laws, I guess. And it's like the time of Alfred the Great, like around the 9th century. The English are having to fight them, but for a while, the actual Vikings, like the Danes, took over England, and they had like 3 or 4 kings that actually ruled. King Sweyn, you can see, Canute, Harold I, and Hartha Canute as well. I think Harold I and Hartha Canute were sons of King Canute. I think Canute might be one of the most famous. It's also spelled Canute, Canute, as well. So you have some of these Vikings that took over and became kings in parts of Europe. But I think most of them were reigning like in Denmark and all that. They also saw like in Ireland. Like if you go to Ireland, you got people with red hair and all that. And so, yeah, that's why that's the truth about that. And Vikings often had more fair skin, blonde, red hair, and things like that. You see like in Northern Europe, more or less. And then from there, you can see they also settled northern Scotland way up there. And then also you can see from there they went into Iceland. as well and settled there, which they start selling Iceland around the 9th, 10th centuries. And then finally they go into also Greenland. There's a Viking named Eric the Red, you may have heard of, who would discover, Greenland. He's the one that coined it. He called it Greenland because he was trying to get people to go there. Because Greenland's really, if you know about it, it's a glacier, basically. So he was trying to get people to settle there. I think Greenland's actually colder than Iceland because it's further north. But it evidently got people to go there and settle, and so they created a Viking settlement there, and all that for a while anyway. Then they got Leif Erikson. He's another famous Viking that's well known. Leif also was known for exploring part of, they think, the North Atlantic, discovering what would be, he's the one who discovers part of North American Canada, like they think Eastern Canada. And it's believed that the Vikings settled in what is, they think, maybe the northern tip of what is, they got the so-called Vinland map here, which kind of shows you maybe where they think it was. It's kind of a debate about where it was, more or less. The Vinland map was a famous map they found in modern times, which they think depicts where they think the Vikings settled, which is right here. Which some people think it was Newfoundland. Some people think it's Nova Scotia, possibly, of where it is. Erikson was also called, they called him Leif the Lucky, because he was kind of lucky in finding things as an explorer. But the Vikings actually would settle, they think, Newfoundland for sure, because they do found like archaeological sites like Leon's All Meadows, which that's still on the northern tip there. They think was created about circa maybe 1000, more or less. So I think they called it Vinland. Yeah, Vinland. That's the name. Vinland or Vineland is, I think, usually the common name that the Vikings called, that particular land, because they found like wild grapes growing there, which were brought back to Iceland. And so there's a bunch of like these Viking epic poems, like the Icelandic epics and other epics that were written about Viking exploration and all that. And but they think what happened was the Vikings later would abandon Canada or North America because of like basically Native American cultures that were kind of, taking over that region. They think they called them Skreelings was the original name of the so-called, they call them Thule people, Thule, Thule, or people say also the Inuit, like the people live with igloos later and all that in Canada and Alaska. But they abandoned it within like a generation or so. And so the Vikings, never came back and all that. So one thing they do think about the Vikings, more or less, they think the Vikings were the first Europeans to really discover, America. They were the first to do that, around 1000 CE. But you don't really have anybody else come back until the time of Columbus in the late 15th century, about 500 years later. So that's something they do give credit for for the Vikings being the first Europeans to do that. But obviously the Native American peoples that were already there have been there for thousands of years already, before they actually discovered it, and it was kind of lost for a long time, more or less. Hey, Markella, hope you're having a great morning out there also as well. So we're kind of talking about, the Vinland map and all that, and what they think was Vinland in North America. Going back up to this map right here, also you can see in the map that you had Vikings that came into, you look here, there's some that came out of like Norway, Sweden, I guess, and settled in Normandy, right here in what is northern France. And you have, they call them Normans. I think they came out of Norway, I guess. That's the name or whatever. They would settle there in northern France, which was called Normandy afterwards. And they had this chieftain they had that led them named Rollo, who was kind of famous. I think you lived, I want to say, around the 9th, 10th century. And he formed this alliance with France, like the early kingdom of France, which was kind of developing at that time. And what happened was the Normans that took over Normandy, like in northern France, became like this duchy, or the Duchy of Normandy, I think they call it later, which is later part of the Kingdom of France originally. And so all the rulers afterwards were called the Dukes of Normandy, basically, that you have. So it's kind of weird too, because like the Normans become this culture that is kind of a mix of like Viking, Frankish culture or French culture that becomes Catholic. They convert to Roman Catholicism, and I guess they intermarry with the women there and all of that. And later on, the Normans will later, if you know about this, they invade parts of Europe. They take over southern Italy. They take over Sicily. They also take over England. They're actually kind of spread out, throughout Europe. And the most famous was the takeover of England, the so-called Norman conquest that happened in 1066, when one of their descendants, William the Duke of Normandy, who was later called William the Conqueror, as they call him in England, would come over and conquer England and defeat the Anglo-Saxons that still ruled over parts of England. And he's, of course, if you know about William, later called William the First, he was known for the Battle of Hastings in October of 1066, where he defeated the last Anglo-Saxon king you see there, Harold Hardrada. And so from there, the so-called Norman dynasty took over. So the Normans took over like England. They ruled northern France and other parts of France after that. And so they think the Normans are kind of instrumental because they helped to kind of spread like the ideals of like feudalism, like in France and in England. And I think William the First, William the Conqueror, was also known for the Domesday Book. You may have heard of that he issued on 1086, which is a great survey of England, surveying all the lands that King William owned, after he conquered England and all that. It's like we have Daphne join us also, so I hope you're having a great morning also out there as well. Also in the map here, you can see if you go to the eastern part of it, like in this area here, you got also Vikings from like maybe Sweden that kind of spread out eastward into Russia, in the Ukraine. So they got that too as well that occurs. And so the Vikings settled there because they were trying to start trade with like Asia, the Byzantine Empire, which was like, around Turkey and the Black Sea. So yeah, that was part of why they went into those areas. So like in the video, they talked how they used the Viking ship to get down into Russia, like the Don, the Volga River, the Dnieper, things like that. The Slavs called them the Rus, but I think their original name, they were called Varangians, was the common name. They called the Vikings. It's like something like a Star Trek nickname there. But anyway, they call them Rus because the term Rus was a Slavic nickname for the fact that the Vikings would row their ships, the long ships. So I think Rus meant to row, like the rowers, I guess they called them, basically. So Russia basically meant the land of the Rus, but meant the land of the rowers because of the Vikings that came in. So the Viking state that gets established there is kind of a combination of a mix of Slavic and Viking peoples. That's kind of what creates the so-called, they call it the Kievan Rus state that kind of forms afterwards, or states that are there, which are based around the Ukraine mostly, in what is like where Kiev is today. Kiev is the capital of Ukraine, and for a long time that was the central city or capital of like this early Russian state that formed there. Later, Moscow will be more important to the Middle Ages, but not now. And they had all these different rulers that came in. They weren't called kings. The early rulers of Russia were not like czars or kings. They were called either a grand prince or a grand duke. I think the first ruler was like the grand prince of Kiev. Those are some of the early rulers on the bottom. The Rurik, I think they say, was one of the first famous ones that reigned, like around close to the 9th century, 9th, 10th century. And Rurik and Oleg, those two, I think, were early famous rulers, which a lot of them were descended from Vikings. And then more into the late 9th, early 10th century, you've got Vladimir the First, known as the Great. He's really considered the first great ruler that they had of the Viking culture. And he was known for converting all of the Russians to Christianity. If you know about it, the Russian culture, in like the Ukraine, was heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire, which Orthodox Christianity, and so they decided to convert everybody to that religion. And so they think Vladimir, close to maybe 1,000, began to convert everybody, and so that's why in Russia that's the main religion later that they have, like with the Russian Empire, etc., up to modern times now. So he's like really one of their first great rulers. I think he died about 1016, about 5 years ago. And I know he's like considered like a saint. I think in the Eastern Orthodox Church in Russia and all that today. But yeah, they had a dynasty. It was called the Rurik dynasty, which they think was named after Rurik. And so later, when you have the czars, like I think Ivan III, Ivan IV, like Ivan the Terrible, all that later, in more into early modern Russia. Those are kind of descended back to supposedly, that particular dynasty and all that. But you can see besides religion, like language, like the Russian language, Cyrillic, was something that evolved from, they think, from Greek, from the Byzantine Empire. They think that it was named after this guy named Cyril, I think it was. He was some kind of Byzantine Christian monk that came to Russia and helped them develop their language and all that. A lot of your architecture in Russia was influenced by the Byzantine Empire, like St. Basil's Cathedral, in Moscow as an example, like with its onion domes and all that, are highly influenced by Byzantine culture and all that. That's why all the czars are called czars, because it's named after the term Caesar, which I guess they still used at the Byzantine Empire as well. Later, Russia sees, Moscow as the third Rome, because, Rome, Constantinople, and then Moscow, but that's more like into, I guess, modern times later. So kind of talking about the Vikings, how the Viking culture kind of just spread, throughout Europe and all that. Why did the Vikings decline? Well, they converted to Christianity. They began to settle down throughout Europe. The rise of feudalism, I think, more or less in Europe, also probably contributed to why they declined. But pretty much their culture kind of merged with other European cultures. They became Christian, had a lot to do with it, more or less. So people in Europe, a lot of them are still descended from some Vikings, that kind of settled there, not just in Scandinavia, but other parts of Europe as well. All right, let me go ahead and move on next. We're going to, of course, talk a lot today also about the Crusades. That's of course another big topic, which the Crusades was a major event that occurred during the High Middle Ages. In fact, the most famous event that really occurs, the High Middle Ages kind of peaks around, I guess, about the 11th, 13th centuries is about when it is. And you can see here that the Crusades were a series of wars, which they were, fought between Christians and Muslims, especially the Catholic West, like Catholic Europe in general, was on one side, of course, fighting in the wars. And they fought to control Jerusalem. A lot of the Christians in the West wanted to take back the Holy Land, like where Israel is, and a lot of the lands that were kind of around, like from Turkey all the way down to Israel. Turkey, probably Syria, Lebanon, Israel, all those areas which, by the way, had been part of the Byzantine Empire, which had, I guess, been controlled by Christians a long time ago. They wanted to get back all this land. So that was pretty much their intentions of it. And they do think that part of why it happened was because the Byzantine Empire was declining in the East. It was. And they asked for help. Well, literally, they came to, they wanted basically, they wanted support, from them to fight the Seljuk Turks, the Turks who had come into the Middle East, like they took over Turkey and all that. Turks were more warlike because they were Caucasian peoples. So they were kind of created a lot of conflict between Christians and Muslims, which kind of brought on the wars between them, which would go on for multiple centuries up to like the 13th. And I think even some of the Crusades went up to the 14th century, believe it or not, because there was 10 or more Crusades at one point that were fought. They think how the Crusades kind of got started. was they had this ruler in the Byzantine Empire named Alexius the First, or Alexius Comnenus, who evidently needed military aid because a lot of his empire was being shrunk. If you go back to, I think, 1071, I believe it was, Battle of Manzikert, the Turks, under the Seljuk Turks, had taken over Turkey. And so that brought on the Crusades, afterwards. And so they asked the Catholic Church for help in the West, like in Rome. And so one of the popes at the time, his name was Pope Urban II, decided to intervene. And he started giving sermons, about helping, the Christians and their Christian brothers in the East. I think it was in 1095 when this happened. And he also said, Urban II also said that if any crusader went and fought in the East, in the Crusades, that all their sins would be forgiven, no matter what they did. They killed somebody or whatever, they would be forgiven totally for it. They think that's where the indulgences thing came from. About that was big in the Reformation, was because of the Crusades. It was kind of like an indulgence, really. So yeah, that brought on all the Crusades that followed afterwards, which there were numerous Crusades that happened. Like I said, there were up to probably about 10 of them at one that were fought. Of course, here's a kind of a picture here, of course, of the first three that were probably the first 2 or 3 were the kind of the most famous ones that they had, literally, that occurred in the early Crusades. The first Crusade was the most successful of all the Crusades, probably because they didn't know they were coming, I guess, the Turks, and also the fact that I think they put up the most forces. The Christians in the West did, which there may have been as many as 100,000 people that may have got involved in the first Crusade at one point. That were combatants and non-combatants that actually fought in the first Crusade and all that. And the first Crusade was actually 2 crusades. It wasn't one. There was actually this one crusade called the People's Crusade, which started out around 1096. It was led by this preacher named Peter the Hermit. They marched across Europe, and it was famous for different things. I don't know if you know much about it, but they were kind of like, as they marched across Europe, and kind of on a map right here showing you, they massacred anybody that wasn't considered Catholic. Like if you were a Jew or something like that, they basically killed you. They massacred a lot of Jews as they went eastward. Kind of horrible. Muslims too, as well. And so you can see they marched towards Constantinople right there. And then this particular crusade, at least the People's Crusade, like that one got wiped out. It never made it. They all got killed right there. They got wiped out. But they had another crusade called the Prince's Crusade that followed that was more successful, that one. With that one, they think they were more successful in it. But it took them a while, but by July of 1099, they retook the city of Jerusalem. But you can see there they also retook parts of Turkey. They retook Syria, Lebanon, and most of Israel was also retaken as well. So pretty much this area here, Turkey, from Odessa down through Antioch, Tripoli, Accra, Jerusalem. So all these areas were areas that they re-seized in the First Crusade. So that's why they talk about that one being, the most important one, I guess, they had overall, because of the fact that they were so successful, with it. Now, following the First Crusade, one of the things that happened that's well known was they created a lot of these so-called Crusader States afterwards to kind of settle those areas that they took, from the Turks at that point. These were mostly Christian states or kingdoms or principalities, whatever you want to call them, that the Crusaders called them outremer states, which outremer means was a kind of a Latin term that meant overseas states. And they became like these Catholic realms, basically, that were ruled either by monarchs or nobility. And there were 4 of them that were there, of course, you can see in the map. They were basically, I'll give them on the screen here, but they were basically the county of Edessa was first, the Principality of Antioch was another one, county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So you can see all the dates that they were around at one point which you can see the Kingdom of Jerusalem was the one that was the longest around. It was up to like the late 13th century. It existed at one point. And it was the only one that had a king. All the other ones had pretty much either a count or a prince that reigned over them. So you can see in the map here, that'll look right here. The county of Edessa was primarily like where part of Syria is today, southern Turkey. One of Antioch was in mostly like Syria, Lebanon. County of Tripoli was in kind of like southern Lebanon. And the Kingdom of Israel was in basically in most of Israel and part of like Jordan today. So those are all the areas they existed at one point. And over time, it's gonna shrink. You'll see that's like the biggest, I think, right now at that point. But over time, it'll eventually shrink. Also, if you go to the map here, there was one called the Principality of Armenia, Cilicia. I don't think you really got to know about that one, but that was another Christian state they formed also, which was done by the Armenians. Armenians were Christians that were in like eastern Turkey and also around where the kind of like Georgia and the Caucasus region is between the Caspian and Black Sea. They had a kingdom there, the Kingdom of Armenia, but it was destroyed by the Turks. And so they fled west, and they were able to create a state there because they're Christian, all of that. And so that's what that was there. And it was actually a state there for a while, up to like the Crusader period as well. But over time, it gets all those areas get wiped out eventually by the Turks and all that later. Now, another thing I did want to mention, which is true about the Crusades, after the Crusades ended, you had this other deal where they had various military orders that were created because of the Crusades. Because most of the Crusaders went back home after the first conflict. There was like very few of them left afterwards, and some were left behind to kind of guard over the Holy Land, protect any unarmed pilgrims that wanted to visit or merchants that wanted to come to that raid to do trade in the region and all that. And so they created all these different orders that were kind of famous, like you may have heard of. Here's some, of course, that were famous. The Knights Templar, the Templars, was the most famous order that they had that was well known. Knights Hospitallers, also called the Knights of St. John. Order of St. James, which is more of a Spanish type, order that was famous. Order of Calatrava, which is also a Spanish order as well. And the Teutonic Knights was a German order that was also famous. So you get all these military orders that start kind of springing up everywhere, not just in like the Middle East, but in Europe, that also fighting a lot of wars later. Knights Templar, is a Catholic order. You see found in 1119. They did have their actual headquarters on the actual Temple Mount, where the old Temple of Jerusalem was in Israel. And they think the headquarters was where the Dome of the Rock was. Believe it or not, they actually put it there originally. They're famous for their Red Cross, which you see a lot on their uniforms, like on their shields. I think they had a Red Cross. Teutonic Knights had a Black Cross. I think the Knights Hospitaller, Knights of St. John, had a White Cross. So different orders had different color crosses. I think the Knights of St. James in Spain had a Red Cross, like the Templars also did as well. But the Templars were like the shock troops, the Crusades, like especially in the Middle East. They were kind of this quasi-religious. They're almost like these monk warriors, basically, who had strange rituals, like initiation rites, they believe. But they were very wealthy. They owned a lot of land. They practically started the whole Christian finance or banking system throughout Europe. And they controlled numerous fortifications throughout the Middle East and so on. They're very, very powerful, the Templars. Of course, there's a lot of rumors about the Templars that they knew secrets about, like the Holy Grail, where the Ark of the Covenant was at one point, that are people still talking about today. Some even think that the Freemasons of today are kind of descended back to the Knights Templar and other types of groups like that, because they were controlled by these grand masters that were kind of like master knights that were part of it. So that's basically some of these orders of knights, but they're around throughout the High Middle Ages. But later on they get stamped out and wiped out, especially the Knights Templar. Right, moving on, I did want to talk about some of the other crusades that they had. They had another crusade, which was the so-called Second Crusade, which that one was unsuccessful. It was fought because of the fact that the county of Edessa fell in the 1140s. It was conquered by the Turks. They got it back. And so it brought on these different rulers, like the King of France, Louis VII, and the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Germany, Conrad III, sent forces from Europe to try to get it back, but they failed. They lost, of course, the Turks in 1149. I think the only positive thing they got out of it, if you knew about that, Christians in the Second Crusade, was that some of the Christians that were sailing from England to Europe landed in Portugal. They seized Lisbon from the Moors. And so Portugal became a Christian state later because of the Crusades. Something kind of new I didn't know about. But so yeah, that crusade didn't go well. Then they had the Third Crusade. That one might be the second most famous one after the First Crusade. Those two are pretty famous, the First and Third Crusades, which that one occurred because of the Kurdish sultan and general named Saladin, or also called Salah ad-Din, that became very powerful during the around the Third Crusade at that point. And Saladin was he was actually of Kurdish origins. I think they say that Saladin is the most famous Kurd in history. He's still kind of a hero to them. Kurds, a lot of them live in northern Iraq, and probably around, I guess, part of Iran as well. And he's a founder of what they call the Ayyubid dynasty. The Ayyubid dynasty is a dynasty that reigned over basically Egypt and Syria during that time. Anyway, his armies were very powerful, so much that eventually they would defeat the kingdom of Jerusalem, like their main armies. And at the Battle of Hattin, sometimes called the Horns of Hattin, by the way, by Christians, 1186, he crushed their forces and then marched and laid siege to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem fell in 1187. So that was kind of a major turning point, in the Crusades. And they think that the taking of Jerusalem by Saladin is what brought on the so-called Third Crusade, of course, that followed next. So that's what brought it on at that point. And the Third Crusade had a nickname. It was often called the King's Crusade. That's what people called it in Europe, because of the fact that all these European kings decided to intervene directly in the conflicts with the Turks. And so that's hence its name and all that. And so you got countries like France, England, the Holy Roman Empire would send forces, but half of it was a failure in the end. Here's examples of some of the monarchs that were involved that were very famous in the Third Crusade, why it's called the King's Crusade. But you got Richard I. You've heard of him, called the Lionheart, probably the most famous one. Who was from England. He was, of course, one of the sons of King John II. Him and was it King John? I think it was, or whatever it was. His name was. One of the sons of King Henry II. Excuse me. It was King John and King Richard were the son of King Henry II. But then you got Philip II. Augustus, or Philip Augustus of France, the king there. Richard and Philip II didn't like each other too much, but they put their differences aside to fight in the Third Crusade. And Frederick Barbarossa, sometimes called Frederick I of Germany, also kind of participated, but he died on the way there in Turkey when he was crossing the river. He drowned, basically. So he didn't really make it. But they think that Richard was really, out of the different kings, he was really the most successful overall. He fought Saladin to a draw pretty much, but he was able to take control of a lot of the major cities, like in Israel, like Accra and Jaffa. And so, but he wasn't able to seize Jerusalem. That was the only thing about it, with the Third Crusade. So I'm kind of viewed as a failure, Third Crusade. because they weren't able to take everything back. But they did kind of seize a lot of the coastal area of Israel, Lebanon, back from the Turks at that point. They did sue for peace. Like, that's one thing that was kind of interesting about the Crusaders in Saladin. It was the first case of where they actually sued for peace in a treaty, which kind of sometimes would happen in some of the Crusades. And so in 1192, there was a peace that was kind of decided where what would happen was they decided that the Crusaders decided that the Jerusalem would be in Muslim control. They'd be able to keep it basically, but the Turks would have to allow Christians to visit, Israel, like the Holy Land and all that, and merchants could go there and not be harmed and things like that. And so that was something that was decided at that point. So you do have that kind of occur at that point. But I guess the first and third Crusades, those are the ones that are the most famous. But they do get Jerusalem back, but it's not till like the Sixth Crusade, but it's only briefly. Now, they had one more crusade, which was kind of controversial. I've got kind of a picture. Oh, here's probably a picture, by the way, showing you kind of the map of what, I guess, the Middle East looks like after the Third Crusade. So you can see all the land they have left at that point. So you can see it's slowly shrinking some of the territory that they have in the Eastern Mediterranean area from Syria, Lebanon, all the way down to Israel. So it's kind of slowly, like half of it's almost gone. At that point, you can see. You can also see a lot of forts and castles that are built up and down the coast also as well to kind of defend these areas from the Turks. And, of course, they have their own castles too on the Islamic side as well. Now, another thing too, I'll mention as well, they have another crusade, which this one's kind of controversial that they have later, which is the so-called Fourth Crusade. Here's kind of a list of some of the later Crusades. They have like at least 9 or 10 Crusades at one point. I'll kind of mention maybe the Children's Crusade that they have as well. That's well known. And what happened was there was supposed to be a Fourth Crusade where what was going to occur was that the Crusaders were going to attack and recapture Jerusalem. They were supposed to attack, by the way, through Egypt. They were going to invade through there and come up the southern coast through Israel. That was backed by the Catholic Church, which a lot of the early Crusades were. Like Pope Innocent III, you can see, was the main pope that backed the Fourth Crusade. But what happened was the Crusaders, for some reason, decided to attack Constantinople. Now, there's different theories on why that happened. Part of it was that a lot of the debts they owed to, like in Italy, like the Venetians, or was one of the, like Venice was one of the main states that was supporting a lot of the Crusaders, bearing them over and all of that. There was also this deal where they wanted to support like a certain ruler on the throne, but it kind of backfired. And what they really wanted to do, a lot of the Crusaders, was they thought that they could loot it basically for riches, because Constantinople was one of the most wealthy cities in that region. I think as they went into like Turkish lands, they realized how poor they were. The Byzantine Empire had all the wealth, and so in 1204 they literally just attacked and looted it. And what's crazy is the Crusaders even tried to put in their own Catholic ruler on the throne of the Byzantine Empire, which they did something like 50, 60 years for a while. So that's one thing that's interesting about the Crusaders. They really didn't trust the Byzantine Empire because of the fact that they were not Catholic. They were like Orthodox Christians. And so that was kind of a thorn, in the side of the whole Crusades, because they didn't really trust each other because of the different religions. And the Catholics thought the Orthodox were kind of heretics because they just believed in the Catholic faith, and vice versa also as well. They do think that the Fourth Crusade caused the East-West Schism, which is sometimes dubbed the Great Schism. And this was the split that happened between the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. Part of why they fought the Crusades was to bring the two churches together. They thought they could bring these Christian brothers together, and fight for one cause. And it actually did the opposite. It actually helped to kind of solidify, I think, the split, which had been kind of going on throughout the Middle Ages. And so it was a combination of religious, ideological, political differences that really split the two churches, over time. A lot of people confuse the Great Schism or East-West Schism with the Papal Schism, where the Catholic Church splits into two popes, one at Avignon in France and one at Italy and Rome. But that's later. That hadn't happened yet when that occurs. That's more in the late Middle Ages. And anyway, that's not the same thing, but it's basically, that's kind of what happens with those two churches. And those two communions are kind of like, they're still kind of split today, but I know there's been some dialogue that's been done between the Catholic and the Orthodox churches where the popes met with some of their patriarchs and things like that. And there's they try to smooth over differences between them, but there's still that. I think since the Crusades, it's kind of still not good. All right. So anyway, let me talk about some of the other crusades. Yeah, you can see kind of a list of them. The Fifth Crusade was a crusade where some Christians tried to invade through Egypt, like they were going to do in the Fourth Crusade. But it was actually defeated by one of Saladin's nephews named Al-Kamil, I think his name was, that he had. But the one that's the more famous one is the Sixth Crusade. That one was led by the King of Germany, or the Holy Roman Emperor, which was Frederick II. Frederick II was the son of Frederick Barbarossa I. And he led forces from Germany to Israel. But they think part of why he was able to retake Jerusalem was because of a treaty that was signed, believe it or not, with the Turks. And Saladin's nephew, named Al-Kamil, which the Crusaders, by the way, called Meladin, and it was caused by a civil war in the Ayyubid dynasty. Saladin had like a lot of children. He had some of his brothers fighting over the throne and all that. And anyway, because of the fact that Egypt was kind of in chaos, Al-Kamil just let Frederick just walk in and take it, basically. And so that's how Frederick was able to seize control of Jerusalem. But they only held it for so many years, up to about the 1240s. They lost it again later. But the Crusaders held like Accra, Jaffa, I think, until like the late 13th century, which were some of the last cities like around Israel that fell to the Turks later. They have later crusades. These you don't have to know about, but you may have heard of St. Louis, Louis the Ninth. Or you've been to like St. Louis Cathedral, New Orleans, of course, it's there now. It's named for him. You know that. He was involved in a bunch of crusades too, 7th, 8th crusades as well. The 13th century. Edward I of England, the King of England, was involved in also the so-called 9th Crusade. They had 13th century as well. Those are all failures. None of them worked out, of course, there. And they have also this other crusade, which is kind of bizarre, that happened in 1222, called the Children's Crusade. That was one where a bunch of children got involved in a crusade, I think in France and other countries like Germany, and they were going to march on the Middle East. They thought that if the Turks saw these kids coming, that they would just give the land up to them or whatever, but they never made it. I think a lot of them went to ports like in France, and they got sold to slavery, basically. So I think that's where the Pied Piper story kind of comes in. If you know about that in Europe, that's kind of famous in medieval times. It's kind of linked to that. I think the Pied Piper may have been somehow involved in that, I know. But pretty much most of the Crusades in the end were a total failure. Like none of them really worked out in the end. In fact, pretty much they think the Crusades, helped to weaken Christianity in the East. Like the Eastern Orthodox faith began to decline. You still got people that are Christian that are there. They begin to be more of a minority because of Islam becomes the main religion, throughout the Middle East. If you know that. And then the Byzantine Empire, also would decline as well. It would weaken it even more later. They get conquered by the Ottoman Empire, where Constantinople falls in 1453. So you got all this kind of going on with the end of the Crusades and all that. Also, I guess on the positive side, if you want to put it this way, at least for, I guess, what happened in Europe, they think that a lot of the European states became more powerful after the Crusades. Kingdom of France, Kingdom of England, Holy Roman Empire. Those states become more powerful after. Like in England, you got the Plantagenet dynasty that you got. That's real famous. That's there. France has got the Capetian dynasty, and they have the Valois dynasty that they have that become powerful in medieval Europe, and so on. The papacy is not as powerful at the High Middle Ages. They're kind of weakened because they had kind of influenced all these Crusades, originally back then, etc. They do think that the Crusades, they think somehow sparked the Renaissance, because apparently a lot of the what happened with the Crusades was that the Crusaders went to the Middle East. They came into contact with a lot of Middle Eastern trade goods that came from Asia, like spices and silk and things like that. And so the Italians later took advantage of that. They started sailing ships to like the Black Sea or whatever, and they enriched themselves off the trade. And then all these rich merchants, like say at Florence and all that, used a lot of their wealth to create art and culture, like be patrons of it or whatever. So that spawned the Renaissance later. So in a sense, the Crusades was one of the things that influenced, the Renaissance later, etc. I think the Crusades influenced also modern exploration later because of Columbus and all that, because of Asian trade goods also as well. So indirectly anyway, with that. So that's my lecture today, of course, on part 2 on the Middle Ages. Of course, tomorrow on Thursday, I'll have my last part 3 lecture, of course, which I'm going to talk about the later Middle Age. I'm going to talk about the invasion of the Mongols, like the Mongol Empire, and their aftermath that comes in the Europe around the 13th century, roughly. Then we've got the other famous things that happened too. Of course, I'll get to the Renaissance. Of course, the main thing we'll talk about, of course, is one of the major events of the late Middle Age you have. But I'll get into like the Black Death, which is something that kind of devastated Europe with the bubonic plague they have. I'll also talk about the 100 Years' War. We'll get into that. That was kind of a major war that was fought in France, between France and England. So I'll talk about those topics tomorrow, more or less. So I hope y'all have a great, rest of the, week today. Don't forget about assignments before I go. Of course, I've told you about RE assignments, of course, that we've got out there. Third vocab still due this week. Of course, I'll have it open till Friday, so I've kind of uploaded that yet, more or less to me. Don't forget about the Roman quiz. There's 2 of them, number 6 and number 7. Those are due by the weekend coming up. And the book report is due next week, of course, also as well. So that's it for today. I hope y'all have a great, like I said, great rest of the week. I'll send an announcement out, of course, about our last lecture tomorrow. But yeah, we're getting close to the end of the semester coming up. So finals next week. Hey, end of the summer, of course, coming up. So y'all take care, and I'll see you later. Y'all take care.